Two men with guns jumped a woman.
She's being robbed and carjacked.
It's a frightening scene.
They robbed the people here, they have guns.
But this brave young woman isn't having it.
She is fighting them tooth and nail.
And this situation just keeps escalating.
My heart just dropped. I said, my kid is going to be killed.
Then, coming up, a man tries to seduce a young girl.
He was coming here and going to that tent.
So her dad takes matters into his own hands.
It looked like he had just seen a ghost.
But is it the right decision?
When emotion takes over, it can get very dangerous.
It's terrifying to watch.
You see the men punching the woman as they try to get her keys.
May 7th, 2016, 9:30 p.m. The west side of Atlanta. A woman pulls up to a gas station located just off I-20 on East Hamilton Holmes Drive. She goes into the convenience store unaware that trouble is following her, and the cameras are rolling. On her way out, the woman does a quick good deed.
She gives a homeless man who's outside the door of the convenience store some money.
Little does she know what awaits her around the corner.
She's approached by these two guys. They are armed, and they are demanding her car. They're robbing her. She's being robbed and carjacked.
An attempted robbery is underway. From inside, the terrified gas station attendant dials 911, unsure how many attackers there are.
So 3-4 guys that robbed the people here, they have guns.
Outnumbered and unarmed, the woman faces her attackers as they steal her keys. But they don't know who they're dealing with.
She's not having it. She's not having any of it. And she is fighting them tooth and nail.
20 miles away in Marietta, Georgia, Billy Warren will soon catch the whole terrifying scene on his television.
My wife and I were getting ready to go to bed. And so the news comes on, it says, breaking news in Atlanta.
Two men with guns jumped a woman.
That woman is his 24-year-old daughter, Jasmine, his only child, and she is in a fight for her life. Billy watches the video in horror.
So many emotions run through your body so quickly that you say to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
So she was literally on her own and did quite well, by the way.
She's a tomboy. She loves weightlifting. She spends a good portion of her time running and in the gym, and she just goes for it.
Jasmine opens the driver's side car door and pulls one of the men out of her car. And things don't stop there. When the other man tries to rescue his accomplice, she goes after the gunman again.
This could have gone really, really wrong for her. These guys were armed with a gun. Why would you do that? You know, why would you put up such a fight over a car? You know, a car could be replaced, you know, but you cannot.
But then, events take an even more dangerous turn.
When he hit her with the gun, she said, okay, it's time for me to shift into a second gear. And then she begins to explode on him, and the other guy comes around to try to pull her off him. Then I'm saying, she's taking a stance. She knows what she's doing. She's made a decision.
Still, Jasmine's dad holds his breath in fear as he watches what happens next. Jasmine goes after the gunman again, but it's a very dangerous decision. The gunman and his accomplice try to drive away, but she still refuses to let them take her car.
So she's fighting with these guys. And then the ignition key breaks off in the car, and they can no longer even take the car at this point.
In the midst of the chaos, a car has pulled up behind and seems to pause to watch the unfolding drama. Who's inside? Are they a part of this too? Or are they just too scared to get involved?
We've seen in some other videos where Good Samaritans will jump in, but generally that is not the case. Their fear of being injured or maybe even killed, you know, prevents them from going that extra step to try to help out the person who's being, you know, assaulted right in front of them.
And now, Jasmine's attackers have become even more hostile and aggressive. punching her forcefully. Neither the store clerk or the homeless man Jasmine gave money to minutes earlier are anywhere to be seen.
None of these people chose to intervene to help this young lady out.
Incredibly, Jasmine comes at the gunman a fourth time. They struggle with the handgun, and as the car behind them pulls away, she finally decides to run. Her dad is in shock.
After I saw the gun, I said I could be in a situation where I'm putting my daughter in a casket, and no parent wants to bury their child.
And for Jasmine, it looks like there's no escape. She desperately tries to get inside the gas station, only to find that the door is locked.
My heart just dropped. I said, my kid is going to be killed.
At 9:30 p.m. on the night of May 7th, 2016, a 24-year-old woman is attacked by two men attempting to steal her car.
Got 3-4 guys that robbed the people here. They have guns.
No one's coming to help her. She is on her own against these two.
But the would-be carjackers didn't realize who they were up against, and Jasmine Warren wasn't about to go down without a fight.
It was Cinco de Mayo weekend, and a lot of my friends, they were coming back from college, so we were going to go out.
Jasmine had stopped to buy some Tylenol on her way to a club in downtown Atlanta.
I walked out of the store, and I didn't see them. They, of course, saw me. And the one guy had the gun, and it just right then like hit me like, oh my God, there's a gun in my face.
What should have been a fun night out has become a potentially deadly situation.
He just kept telling me to give me the keys, give me the keys. So I gave him the keys. But as soon as they got in the car and I'm looking at this whole entire thing happen in front of me, it dawned on me like, I really don't want this to happen. I was like, no, you're not about to do this today, no.
Jasmine makes a quick, calculated assessment of her attackers and decides she can take a risk.
When I saw the movements, I was like, oh, these guys are amateurs. They don't know what they're doing.
That's when Jasmine, who worked as a youth counselor for the city of Atlanta, jumps into action.
They were kids and they were scared. I became like G.I. Jane in 2 minutes.
Still, Jasmine knows she's no match for a loaded firearm.
Yeah, he said to me, I'm gonna shoot you, I'm gonna shoot you. That last time when he cocked the gun, that was the moment where it hit me like, oh no. I didn't know what his intentions was, so I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna run.
She makes a break for the convenience store door, but to her dismay, the door is locked.
The guy wasn't even trying to open the door. Like at first I was having to yank it. He didn't want to open it. I'm like, open the door.
For a terrifying moment, Jasmine isn't sure what will happen next. But then, the gas station attendant, who knows police are on the way, finally relents.
Literally, he opened the door. I went in for 2 seconds and came back out because a police officer had pulled up.
To Jasmine's relief, the would-be carjackers have fled the scene, and she is finally safe. And that's when the gravity of it all really sinks in.
I was like, oh my God, I could have died. Oh my God, why did I do that? Like the actual realization, like this really just happened. Like I really just did all of this within this moment of these kids about to take my car.
The first person Jasmine talks to is her father, Billy.
I rushed to the phone. I call her. I'm like, Jay, where are you? Are you okay? And she says, Dad, I'm fine. I had a couple of guys that tried to take my car. And so I get up, I get dressed, and I drove to Atlanta. So it took me about 20 minutes to get to her.
For Billy, the most chilling part is how frighteningly close he came to losing his daughter.
I says, Jasmine, I need to understand something. You were faced with someone who had a gun in your face. Sweetie, what were you thinking fighting these guys?
And brave as her actions were, Jasmine knows she took a huge risk.
You guys, please do not do this. I could be 6 feet under, or I could be crippled, or I could be blind. I could be a lot of things right now, depending on if I would have got shot. I would definitely never do that again.
If these were more hardened criminals, seasoned criminals, so to speak, then it's possible that this could have gone even worse than what it was.
For Billy, it's too much to even think about, and his emotions are all over the place.
Yeah, I was proud that she reacted. I was not proud that she continued to scuffle. But then I guess I'm partially at blame because I've always taught her to stand up for what she thinks is right.
Police launch an intense search for Jasmine's attackers, but never find them. And surprisingly, years later, Jasmine says she isn't angry with them.
I was a youth counselor for the city of Atlanta, for the Atlanta Workforce Development Agency, so it helped me understand what other people have endured or deal with. I did forgive them.
And coming up, another dad witnesses potential harm to his daughter, so he sets up a sting operation to protect her.
I had to do what was right for my kid.
Thursday, June 22nd, 2017, Del City, Oklahoma, 12:52 a.m. A man in a baseball hat strolls into a backyard and unzips the door to a tent. What is he doing here?
It all looks pretty innocent at first. I mean, maybe it's just a dad checking on his kids, camping out at night. It looks totally normal and calm at first.
But it quickly becomes obvious to the homeowners that there is nothing innocent about this.
So this guy doesn't belong here. He doesn't live here.
It turns out that this is a 33-year-old man who has been communicating by text with the 15-year-old girl who lives in the home.
She told him that she was gonna be camping in her backyard that Friday and that he should come over.
Whatever the teen thinks is going to happen, the man has come here for only one very disturbing reason.
He came over to have sex in her backyard, the 15-year-old girl. It's just wrong. I mean, it's wrong.
It's all really sickening. And what this man doesn't know is that he's in for a big surprise. The dad has gotten wind of his plan, and he's decided to do something about it.
My dad was extremely irate, as he should be. I have two daughters that age, and I would feel the same way as he did. He was very, very upset.
The dad is so upset, he arranges an elaborate family sting operation.
The father puts together an ad hoc posse of individuals who are going to deal with this guy.
They had it all set up, and he didn't have a chance.
As the man leans down to unzip the tent, expecting to find the teen, he has no idea that her mom is the one waiting inside. And he never sees her dad and two other family members as they sneak up behind and tackle him.
He didn't see them, and they took him to the ground.
But now, what's going to happen? They don't know anything about this guy.
You got to think, if the suspect would have had a firearm, you just never know with people like that. You don't know what they're bringing to the table. You don't know what they have on them.
And with emotions running so high, what is the family going to do with him next?
One of the reasons why vigilantism can get pretty dangerous is you're dealing with the unknown. You're not a trained professional. Somebody can get very seriously hurt or killed. When emotion takes over and that desire to intervene and exact perhaps even a little bit of revenge, it can get very dangerous.
Especially when they find out the shocking truth about just who this guy really is. When a 33-year-old man who's been sending sexually inappropriate texts to a 15-year-old girl shows up at her home for what he thinks is going to be a rendezvous, he's stunned when he's greeted by her dad instead.
His eyes were so wide that they looked like saucers. He just kind of went sheet white. It looked like he had just seen a ghost.
The ordeal begins when Fred Morano notices his daughter huddled secretly in a corner with her phone and has a gut instinct that something isn't right.
I'm a pretty protective dad. So I walk over, she didn't know I was there, and snagged her phone out of her hand. Very first thing I saw was, send me a picture. My blood started boiling. There was a lot of lewd, very lewd comments that you don't make to a 15-year-old girl.
And it gets worse. He quickly learns the lewd texter is almost 20 years older than his teenager.
I researched him through Facebook. My heart sunk. I can't comprehend. I mean, I'm 40, you know, to even look at a child. I was disgusted, and it just can't happen. Not in my house.
Fred also learns that the man has been communicating with his daughter on social media for almost a month. She knows how old he is, but they have exchanged suggestive photographs, and now he has convinced the teen to meet him in her backyard tent.
I asked her why. I said, why would you do this? She would never really give me a straight answer. She had a lot going on in her life. I didn't get my daughter until she was 11 years old. I didn't even know she existed until she was 9. So at that point in time, she still hadn't really come into her own. So she was kind of looking for that outreach.
Concerned for his daughter and furious, Fred goes straight to the police.
I said, well, you know, you can read these text messages. They're planning to meet in my backyard tonight. You done? He's like, nothing can be done until he comes on your property. So we have cameras in our living room. We have cameras in our front porch. We have cameras in our driveway, cameras in our backyard. As a father, I had to do what was right. I wanted to make sure that this didn't happen to anybody else.
So that night, with his daughter hiding safely upstairs in her bedroom, Fred uses her phone to text the man, as if everything is still a go.
He texted close to the time that he was going to come over, and we did respond with, I'm waiting.
Fred corrals family members to help. One keeps watch out front, and the rest are hiding in the backyard.
We were stacked up by the back door. It was me, my nephew, and my cousin. My wife was in the tent with a baseball bat. You don't know what you're getting into. I was scared out of my mind.
Then, at 12:52 a.m., it's on. Oblivious to the cameras and what he's walking into, the man strolls into the yard and casually leans down to open the door of the tent. That's when they pounce.
So as soon as he hit that tent, he was down. He didn't have time to even think. We tackled him to the ground. We took zip ties and tied his feet together, and then we took zip ties and tied his hands together. You've stepped into the wrong backyard with the wrong set of people.
With the man restrained, the family calls police, who arrive within minutes and take the suspect, 33-year-old Jeremy Wilson, into custody. That's when the potential danger of the situation really sinks in. At one point, they even thought Wilson might have a gun.
Yeah, I was watching his hands. He's reaching. Wait, is he reaching? Nope. Okay, he's not reaching. It was a big sigh of relief once they had him on the ground. And at that point in time, it was just...
They protected their daughter, and they were lucky.
I don't even know how I would respond in a situation like that if it was my daughter. I can't blame them. I would probably do the same thing.
As the video of Wilson's shocking family-style takedown makes worldwide news,
father creating an elaborate sting. He was coming here and going to that tent
to catch a child predator.
Fred's actions are widely applauded.
Police say they don't condone vigilante justice, but say they're not filing any charges against the girl's family.
Before police take Wilson away in handcuffs, Fred grills him about why he dared to walk into his backyard in the first place.
A lot of it was just, I'm sorry. I was just here to talk to her, that he was there to help her. I didn't pay any attention to it. He was there to have sex with my daughter.
And when police interrogate Wilson and go through the texts he sent the 15-year-old girl, they are certain that he only came for one thing.
When he got there and he was in custody, he had a condom in his pocket. During their messages, he told her he would have to wear a condom. He asked her for pictures, naked pictures. He sent one of his genitals to her.
But this story has an even more disturbing twist. It turns out Wilson reached out to the girl on Facebook because he wanted to reconnect. Many years earlier, he'd been a friend of her mother's.
Jeremy used to change my daughter's diapers when she was a baby. He'd babysit her, take care of her.
This is just being a predator on a whole new level. You changed her diapers as a baby. You're almost 20 years older than her, and now you want to have sex with her? As a mother, this just makes my blood boil.
What makes a person do that?
Wilson never offers an answer, and as far as police can tell, has no remorse.
I think the only regret he had was that he got caught.
Wilson is charged with unlawful communication using technology and is sentenced to 10 years behind bars, but is now out on probation. As for Fred Morano, who had a stern talk with his 15-year-old following the incident, he says he would definitely do it all over again.
Talk to your kids. If they're silent for a reason. So talk to them. This is about protecting your kids. You've got to do what it takes to take care of your family.
What would you do if you came face to face with a loaded gun?
The lone gunman waved what police say was a heavily modified pistol around the room, ordering people on the ground.
One man in St. Louis doesn't seem to sweat it, coolly lighting up a cigarette.
He's like, no, I'm not having it. This isn't a normal human reaction. You can't believe your eyes.
He was making wisecracks the whole time.
But sometimes bravado can be deadly.
I'm laying on the ground thinking, he's probably going to kill everybody in here.
This is a potential bloodbath.
And later, a heist takes place in plain sight.
There are eyes on you everywhere.
Leading to a high-stakes, high-speed chase.
They're going 100 miles an hour into a populated area.
With a shocking conclusion. Sometimes, an ordinary Tuesday night can take an extraordinary turn.
How would you react during an armed robbery?
St. Louis, Missouri, August 28, 2019. Berman's Tavern has been in operation since the mid-1930s. The beloved local bar may be old, but it's equipped with modern technology, like surveillance cameras. And those cameras are running at 12:30 a.m. when a patron walks into the bar and turns a typical night into a potentially deadly showdown.
You see this guy come in with this huge gun and threaten everybody, get on the floor. So it's really, really nerve-wracking. It's terrifying because you don't know what's gonna happen. He has a loaded gun.
However, there's one man who doesn't even flinch. He stays right in his seat and casually scrolls through his phone.
He's sitting there with his beer, like, forget about it.
The armed robber notices the one patron who refuses to comply with his orders.
He says, give me your wallet. And he goes, I got $2 in my wallet, and that's for my beer. And you ain't getting it.
Then the robber grabs for his cell phone. But the patron refuses to give it up, even though there's a gun just inches from his head. He yanks the phone right back out of the robber's hands.
He's like, no, I'm not having it. And so you see that it's kind of throwing the guy off because this isn't anything that you expect. This isn't even a normal human reaction. This is a superhero reaction. You can't believe your eyes.
Then the man defiantly lights up a cigarette, showing no fear, even as the patron right next to him empties out his wallet. Who is this man? And why is he unafraid of the large gun in this robber's hands? The man's name is Tony Tovar. He's a 57-year-old master mechanic who lives just blocks away in the South City neighborhood. And bartender Dustin Kruger knows him well.
He's a regular, he's a good friend of mine. I was very surprised by his reaction. I've had guns pulled on me before, but that's the biggest gun that's ever been, put in my face. I went out from behind the bar because I didn't want to be in close contact with him, within feet of the guy with the gun.
If his life is hanging in the balance, Tony doesn't seem to care. Startled and confused at this strange behavior, The armed robber decides to walk away from Tony and goes around the bar to open the register.
While the dude was on the other side of the bar taking money, Tony asked for a beer. He's like, hey, if you're going to steal from him, might as well steal a beer for me.
And the guy looks at him, and he's just like, get your own freaking beer, man. And Tony goes, well, I'm just saying, if you're robbing the bar, rob it a little for me.
But not everyone finds Tony's attitude amusing. Anything could set the gunman off.
To be quite honest, a lot of what was going through my head at the time was whether Tony was right next to me was going to get his brain splattered on me, because he really wasn't doing anything the gunman said.
And everyone in the bar is acutely aware of what might soon be the terrible, tragic conclusion in this high-wire standoff.
Tony's going to get us all killed. And I know the people next to Tony believe that too. It completely clicked over in our mind that this is what's going to happen. I'm laying on the ground thinking, just shut up, Tony, just stop it. I realize if he's going to kill one person, he's probably going to kill everybody in here.
This is a potential bloodbath.
Tuesday nights are usually slow at Berman's Tavern in St. Louis, Missouri. But just after midnight on August 28, 2019, the customary quiet is shattered.
The lone gunman waved what police say was a heavily modified pistol around the room, ordering people on the ground.
As the armed robber paces around the bar, patrons are terrified. They are now trapped on the ground with no way out.
I'm not going to crawl on the floor and try and get out. I'm not going to try and run for the door. I'm not going to try and charge the gunman. At any moment, he could, lose his mind and just start opening up.
But there's one patron who refuses to comply with the gunman's demands, even with a gun in his back. Mechanic Tony Tovar. Not only did Tony refuse to give up his cell phone, but he then lights up a cigarette and starts joking with the gunman.
He really wasn't doing anything the gunman said. He was making wisecracks the whole time.
I'm laying on the ground thinking, just shut up, Tony. Just being like, shut up, just stop it. Tony's going to get us all killed. I was expecting him to get shot. I was expecting him to die. I was expecting to watch him die. And I'm imagining dealing with the aftermath of people getting shot in my bar because we didn't see any way out of that scenario.
But it turns out Tony has a totally different read on the situation.
I didn't have any fear. I just realized he was just wanting drug money, and he wasn't out to harm anybody. He really wasn't. He just wanted the money. Because if he wanted to harm somebody, he would have already did it.
Tony reminds me of the person who reaches a certain point where they've had it. They're up to here with bad guys, bullies. Because what we know in the heart of someone who's a bully, who's a bad guy, is they're really very weak inside.
But as the agonizing seconds tick by, Tony's wisecracks do seem to break the tension.
I kind of threw him off guard. He wasn't expecting that. I think that put the whole situation at a little more ease.
It appears Tony's unorthodox strategy may actually be working. The gunman refocuses on getting whatever cash he can from the register. All the while, Tony doesn't stop smoking, drinking, and making comments, even as the man right next to him keeps his hands up.
He forced the bartender to open up the cash register, took the cash out, and even took the coins out of the register. Meanwhile, I'm just shaking my head thinking, well, he missed the tip jar because there was more money in the tip jar than there was in the register.
Other patrons begin to relax as well. Taking a cue from Tony, one even lights his own cigarette. And 5 agonizing minutes after he enters the bar, the gunman finally walks out with $200 cash. And luckily, everyone inside is unharmed. Dustin immediately calls 911. And later that evening, St. Louis police arrest 37-year-old Kevin Moore. He's charged with 4 counts of robbery and armed criminal action. He is currently awaiting trial. The surveillance video goes viral, and Tony's cool-as-a-cucumber performance earns him a new nickname.
He's being called the world's chillest man.
He may be the calmest man under pressure in St. Louis.
The world's chillest man.
In fact, on a morning radio station here in St. Louis, they had people call in and said, is this guy a badass or a dumbass? And 90% of the people said badass.
Although the wisdom of Tony's actions is still up for debate, everyone is thankful a potential bloodbath was averted.
Oh, surprisingly and amazingly, everybody walked out okay. And everybody was okay. And it could have been so much worse. And that's been my feeling from the beginning.
After he had been locked up, he actually wrote a letter of apology to the bar, and they posted it behind the bar on the mirror. I apologize for messing up you guys' evening. I apologize for my behavior, in doing what I did.
And although everything ended well, Tony realizes how badly things could have gone.
If you're not positive and you're not real sure, comply, because you may be harmed. It happened the way it did. We're lucky.
And coming up.
Even at 100 miles an hour, you're not going to get away from the cops.
They're going to bail, they're going to bail.
January 19th, 2020, Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. Dashboard cameras on a police cruiser capture a heart-pounding high-speed chase.
With lights and sirens blaring, Bayside police say the driver refused to pull over, instead accelerating at 100 miles per hour.
A chase that leads to a horrific collision. It all happens on I-43, one of the busiest highways in the state.
You're potentially putting thousands of people's lives at risk because that stretch of highway goes right into the heart of downtown Milwaukee.
And whoever is behind the wheel clearly has no intention of stopping.
They went through 3 different jurisdictions.
The chase becomes so dangerous, police are ready to do whatever is necessary to stop it.
As you see in that dash cam, there are officers that are just down I-43 at the ready with stop sticks.
Stop sticks, or spikes, are used to force a car to come to an abrupt halt.
There is definitely a danger in terms of throwing the stop sticks down on a busy highway like that in the middle of the afternoon.
These police have to make a split-second decision. Do they let this car continue to go wildly down the road and potentially injure or kill others? Or do they put these spikes in the road?
Police decide to take the risk, and the fleeing silver Malibu hurdles over the spikes at nearly 100 miles per hour. Then quickly loses control and slams into a wall.
You see that car smash into that median wall and then end up flipping over another vehicle.
It's terrifying to watch. But incredibly, whoever is driving still isn't giving up the chase.
I couldn't believe it when I saw it. They just kept going.
Who is behind the wheel? And why are they so determined to get away? It all begins a half hour earlier, when Officer Tyler Taubenheim of the Grafton Police Department responds to a 911 call from a nearby sporting goods store, where a brazen daylight robbery is underway.
The call came out advising that a retail theft had just occurred.
As other officers pursue the suspects, Taubenheim investigates the scene of the crime.
As I walk in, I see the manager first. Me and Tim walk back to his office where he immediately starts pulling up camera footage. The first thing that stood out is they were very calm. These two suspects came in, was a male and a female. They kind of went here, grabbed a couple things, went there, grabbed a couple of things, and it looked like they were just shopping.
But this criminal couple has no plans of paying for their haul.
It was about 9 minutes total they were in the store. The cashier told me she saw the male and female suspect with armfuls of clothing, and as soon as she made eye contact with them, both of them ran out of the door.
The two suspects jump into a silver Malibu and hit the gas.
They are speeding, and they have one mission in mind: getting away.
That's when the terrifying high-speed chase begins. And in no time, the suspects have flown through 3 different towns.
Once the suspects left the store in Grafton, they headed southbound on I-43 and ultimately ended up in Glendale.
Southbound, half mile north of Silver Springs, to the right to stretch lane, 100.
Even at 100 miles an hour, you're not going to get away from the cops.
But these suspects don't seem to know that. And not even this horrific crash will stop them. So what will it take to bring this chase to an end?
They're gonna bail, they're gonna bail.
2 thieves make a dramatic getaway from a sporting goods store in Wisconsin, leading police in a wild high-speed chase.
The Bayside police officer reports the getaway car speeding at 100 miles per hour.
But they have no idea their every move is caught on camera.
You should know that when you go into a major store, there are eyes on you everywhere. So it's a pretty stupid decision to just run out the front door with arms full of merchandise.
The chase reaches death-defying speeds of 100 miles per hour.
I'm still trying to catch up to it. We're at probably going almost 100.
There's tons of dangers that come into play with other drivers and innocent bystanders.
Traffic is moving over for me.
People get into accidents. It's very high probability of at least minor injuries, if not more severe injuries or possibly even death.
That's what forces police to put the spike strips down.
Continuing south, he's at 100. He's in the far right lane.
They're going 100 miles an hour into a populated area, and spike strips generally, if everything goes as planned, it deflates the tires, just slows people down.
But it's a risky maneuver, and in this case, it has drastic consequences.
But the suspect vehicle swerved.
Switching over to the center lane.
Runs into the back of another innocent vehicle, which sends that innocent vehicle rolling, and it sends the suspect vehicle into the guardrail. You just see this cloud of smoke and parts and snow. It's incredible to watch, and not a good incredible. The innocent bystander vehicle that the suspects hit, you couldn't tell that it even had a trunk. It was all the way smashed into the back window.
It's amazing, only one other car ended up being hit in this crash. There were 2 women inside that vehicle.
To everyone's astonishment, both women survived the crash.
There were only minor injuries, nobody severely injured or killed.
Then, from the smoke and rubble, the passenger of the getaway car emerges, even as the female driver keeps going.
The suspect vehicle starts free-rolling back into the lanes of traffic. You see the male suspect get out of the passenger seat with his arms up. He's like, nope, I'm done. You know, you caught me.
I'm hurt. All right, we're going to get you an ambulance, I promise you, all right? All right.
But the woman isn't ready to give up.
The female driver is still in the car. The car is still moving. Is she still driving? Is she thinking that she can still get away with this?
I'm with the vehicle, still rolling ahead here.
The police quickly move to box in the badly damaged Malibu and finally put an end to this dangerous pursuit.
Hands up! Get your hands up!
Once both suspects were apprehended, They were transported to the hospital to get medical evaluation.
With the suspects safely in custody, the police retrieved the stolen goods.
And my gosh, it's like a whole aisle of sporting goods right there.
They were brought back to the store where they scanned everything back in, ended up being roughly $1,700.
The value of the stolen goods makes this crime a felony, and police want to see what the suspects have to say about it.
We talked with the female suspect first. She was just very polite, cooperative. It kind of seemed like she just accepted the fact that she got caught. And the male suspect, he just kept talking and talking and talking.
Mind talking to us about what happened in Grafton? I ain't gonna lie, I took a sweatsuit out the store.
He was just like, it wasn't me, I wasn't trying to do it, she made me do it. I didn't believe much of it at all.
The male suspect is identified as 37-year-old Daryl Brown, a repeat offender with at least one prior felony conviction. He is charged with 1 count of felony retail theft. The driver, Latosha Walton, is also charged with felony retail theft, along with 2 counts of reckless endangerment and 1 for fleeing pursuit. And all for just $1,700 worth of clothing and sneakers.
It was all for nothing. Every single piece of merchandise that they grabbed ended up being returned to the store.
Luckily, nobody else got injured. The police stopped these 2, and no one got killed. This is nothing short of a miracle.
Dozens of thousands of people were heading toward one stadium. Most of them were thinking about lineups, rivalries, banners, chants, and 90 minutes of football. Some had traveled across Italy through the night. Others had left work early, wrapped themselves in their club's colors, and boarded buses believing they were about to witness one of the most anticipated matches of the season. On May 3rd, 2014, Rome was preparing to host the Coppa Italia final between SSC Napoli and ACF Fiorentina. The atmosphere surrounding the capital was exactly what Italy had seen countless times before a major football occasion: roads filling with supporters, police escorting organized groups, helicopters monitoring traffic from above, and stadium security preparing for another evening under the bright lights of Stadio Olimpico. Yet hidden beneath that familiar routine was a tension that many Italians had learned never to ignore. Football in Italy has always been more than sport. For millions, it represents identity, family history, neighborhood pride, and decades of inherited loyalty. But alongside that passion exists another reality, one shaped by extremist supporter groups, territorial rivalries, and outbreaks of violence that sometimes occur far from the football pitch itself, long before the referee blows the opening whistle. Another contest can begin on the streets outside the stadium. It is a contest with no rules, no trophies, and no winners. On that Saturday evening, one ordinary supporter would become trapped inside that reality. His name was Ciro Esposito. Unlike famous footballers whose faces appeared on television every weekend, Ciro was unknown outside his own community. He was not wealthy. He was not politically influential. He was not a public figure. He was simply one of thousands of Napoli supporters making the journey from Naples to Rome to watch his club compete for silverware. He had no way of knowing that he would never reach his seat inside the stadium. He had no way of knowing that, over the following 53 days, his struggle to survive would become one of the most closely followed stories in modern Italian sport. Even more remarkably, the match itself would eventually become a secondary memory. Years later, when Italians spoke about the 2014 Coppa Italia final, many no longer began with discussions of goals, tactics, or the winning team. Instead, they remembered the violence that unfolded before kickoff. They remembered shooting. They remembered a young man lying wounded on a Roman street. They remembered a hospital room where hope slowly gave way to grief. And they remembered a mother whose response to unimaginable loss would challenge an entire nation too. Reconsider the cycle of hatred surrounding football. Cases involving football violence often disappear from public attention once arrests are made or sentences are handed down. They become another statistic, another entry in police records, another headline gradually replaced by newer events. The death of Ciro Esposito followed a different path. It transformed into a symbol. His name became associated not merely with a criminal case, but with a broader conversation about how deeply violence had become embedded within parts of Italian football culture. Politicians discussed it. Sports journalists revisited it repeatedly. Supporters from rival clubs debated it. Security experts examined every decision that had been made before, during, and after the incident. Questions multiplied. How could a supporter carrying nothing more dangerous than his team's colors end up being shot before entering a football stadium? Why had violence erupted despite police planning? What role had long-standing rivalries between organized supporter groups played in creating the conditions for tragedy? And perhaps most importantly, could this death have been prevented? These questions did not receive simple answers. Investigators would spend months reconstructing the sequence of events. Witnesses described moments of confusion, panic, and rapidly escalating confrontation. Ballistic examinations, forensic analysis, surveillance footage, and testimony would all become pieces of a larger puzzle. At the center of that investigation stood one man identified by prosecutors as the shooter, Daniele DeSantis, a Roma ultra known by the nickname Gaston. According to investigators, he fired multiple shots during the confrontation, striking 3 Napoli supporters. The most seriously wounded was Ciro Esposito. The defense would later argue that DeSantis acted in self-defense after being attacked by a crowd of Napoli supporters. Prosecutors rejected that explanation, maintaining that the physical evidence and witness testimony demonstrated that the use of the firearm could not be justified under the circumstances. Those opposing interpretations would eventually meet in court, where judges would examine every available piece of evidence before reaching a verdict. But on the evening of May 3, 2014, none of those legal arguments yet existed. There were no courtroom proceedings, no forensic reports, and no judicial conclusions. There was only chaos. Somewhere near Viale di Tor di Quinto, several kilometers from Stadio Olimpico, organized groups of supporters encountered one another. Verbal insults quickly escalated into physical confrontation. Bottles, stones, flares, and smoke devices filled the air. Within minutes, confusion spread through the crowd. People ran in different directions, some attempting to escape while others struggled to understand what was happening. Then came the sound that instantly transformed a football-related disturbance into a homicide investigation. Gunfire. Multiple shots echoed through the area. 3 Napoli supporters were struck. One of them suffered injuries so devastating that doctors would later describe his survival to the hospital itself as extraordinary. The bullet that entered Ciro Esposito's body traveled from behind, passed through his lung, and stopped near his spine after causing catastrophic internal damage. Massive blood loss followed almost immediately. Emergency medical personnel rushed him to Rome's Policlinico Universitario Agostino Gemelli Hospital, where surgeons began an operation that would mark the beginning, not the end, of his fight for survival. For days, Italy watched and waited. News bulletins shifted from describing a shooting to reporting on surgeries, medical complications, and cautious optimism. Every encouraging update inspired hope that Ciro might recover. Every setback reminded the public how severe his injuries remained. In Naples, supporters gathered to pray for someone most of them had never met personally. Football rivalries briefly gave way to concern for a critically injured young man whose only Intention that day had been to support his club. As the days stretched into weeks, Ciro's condition became a national story extending far beyond football pages. The country witnessed not only a medical battle, but also the emotional endurance of an entire family, refusing to abandon hope. At the center of that family stood his mother, Antonella Leardi. During the weeks following the shooting, she faced every parent's nightmare while simultaneously becoming an unexpected public voice. Rather than encouraging retaliation or allowing grief to fuel further hostility between rival supporters, she repeatedly appealed for restraint. She asked that no one seek revenge in her son's name. She rejected the idea that one act of violence should be answered with another. Her words carried unusual weight precisely because they came from someone enduring profound personal loss. In a culture where football rivalries can sometimes inflame emotions across entire cities, her calls for peace resonated throughout Italy. They would later become one of the defining human elements of the entire case. Yet during those 53 days, the outcome remained uncertain. Doctors performed multiple procedures. Damaged lung tissue had been removed. Serious infections developed. Respiratory function deteriorated. Intensive care continued around the clock. Medical teams confronted complication after complication, while family members maintained an almost constant presence inside the hospital. Every new day represented another attempt to overcome injuries inflicted in only a few seconds. It is impossible to understand the significance of this case without recognizing that the fatal event did not end when the shots were fired. The shooting itself lasted only moments. Its consequences unfolded across nearly 2 months. Each passing day deepened the emotional investment of the Italian public. Hope repeatedly rose and fell alongside medical updates. By the time Ciro Esposito died on June 25, 2014, approximately 53 days after the shooting, millions already felt as though they had followed his struggle personally. His death transformed what had initially been treated as an act of attempted murder into a completed homicide investigation. It also ensured that the story would never again be viewed solely through the lens of football rivalry. Instead, it became part of a larger national discussion about responsibility, security, and the limits of sporting passion. This is not a story about tactics, league standings, or the result of a cup final. It is not a story intended to glorify confrontation between rival supporters or elevate the individuals responsible for violence. Instead, it is the story of how an ordinary supporter left Naples expecting to watch 90 minutes of football and instead became the face of one of Italy's most significant conversations about public safety, extremism among ultras, and a human cost of hatred that extends beyond the boundaries of the game itself. To understand how that happened, we must begin long before the shooting, with the man at the center of the tragedy, the city that shaped him, and the football club that represented far more than simply a team in blue shirts. Ciro Esposito was never meant to become a symbol. Before newspapers printed his name across front pages and television crews gathered outside a Roman hospital, he lived a life that, by every available account, was remarkably ordinary. He was born in 1985 and grew up in Scampia, a district in the northern part of Naples that has often been portrayed through the lens of crime, poverty, and social hardship. For many people outside Italy, Scampia became internationally known because of media coverage focusing on organized crime and the influence of the Camorra. Yet, like every neighborhood, it was also home to thousands of ordinary families whose daily lives had little to do with the stereotypes that surrounded their community. Families worked, children attended school, neighbors knew one another, and football became one of the few constants capable of bringing people together despite economic difficulties. It was in this environment that Ciro spent his childhood and early adulthood. There is no evidence that he was involved in criminal organizations or extremist political movements. Friends and relatives consistently described him as a quiet, respectful man who worked at a car wash and devoted much of his free time to following the football club he loved. In many ways, his life reflected that of countless young Neapolitans whose routines revolved around work during the week and football on weekends. His story is important precisely because there was nothing extraordinary about it before May 2014. He did not seek public attention. He did not hold a prominent position within football culture. He simply belonged to the enormous community of supporters who considered SSC Napoli more than just a sporting institution. For many residents of Naples, supporting Napoli is inseparable from local identity. The club represents history, resilience, and a sense of belonging that stretches across generations. Families pass their allegiance from parents to children, and match days become shared rituals rather than isolated sporting events. Wearing the blue shirt of Napoli is often understood not merely as supporting 11 players on a football field, but as expressing pride in a city that has long viewed itself as culturally distinct from much of northern Italy. Ciro grew up within that tradition. Football occupied a meaningful place in his life, not because it promised fame or recognition, but because it connected him to friends, relatives, and the city he called home. Those who knew him described him as someone who regularly attended matches, including away fixtures, traveling alongside fellow supporters whenever possible. Yet despite frequently following the club across Italy, there is no indication that he had ever been sanctioned for violent behavior or become known to authorities for causing disturbances. This distinction would later become important because the tragedy that befell him was never presented as the consequence of his own criminal conduct. Instead, he became one of 3 supporters caught in an outbreak of violence that escalated beyond anything an ordinary football fan could reasonably expect. To understand why thousands of Napoli supporters were traveling to Rome on May 3, 2014, it is necessary to appreciate the significance of the Coppa Italia final. The Coppa Italia is one of the country's most prestigious domestic competitions, bringing together clubs from across the Italian football pyramid. Reaching the final represents months of competition, and victory secures not only a major trophy, but also lasting prestige. In 2014, Napoli had earned the opportunity to face Fiorentina at Rome's Stadio Olimpico. Supporters from both clubs prepared to travel from their respective cities to witness what promised to be one of the biggest football occasions of the year. Yet, while Napoli and Fiorentina were the teams competing on the field, another rivalry lingered in the background. Relations between organized groups of Napoli supporters and certain ultras associated with AS Roma have been tense for years. The hostility did not originate on that single afternoon, nor was it unique to one isolated incident. Italian football had experienced repeated episodes in which rival ultras viewed one another as enemies extending far beyond the 90 minutes of a match. These conflicts sometimes involved prearranged confrontations, property damage, assaults, and clashes requiring significant police intervention. Authorities responsible for organizing major football events were well aware of these risks. Consequently, security planning for high-profile matches extended far beyond the stadium itself. Routes were designed to separate supporters from different clubs. Police escorts accompanied organized groups. Officers monitored roads, transportation hubs, and gathering points in an effort to reduce opportunities for confrontation. Such precautions reflected years of experience dealing with football-related public order challenges. They also demonstrated that officials recognized the possibility of violence before the first whistle was ever blown. On the morning of May 3, 2014, however, thousands of Napoli supporters began their journey with a far simpler objective. They wanted to see their team compete for a trophy. Buses departed from Naples carrying supporters dressed in blue, waving scarves and flags, discussing the match ahead rather than the dangers surrounding it. The atmosphere among those making the trip was shaped by anticipation rather than fear. For many supporters, traveling together formed part of the experience itself. Long hours on the road allowed friends to celebrate, debate team selection, predict the final score, and relive memories of previous victories. Football journeys often create a sense of temporary community in which strangers become companions. Through shared loyalty to the same club, there is nothing in the available evidence to suggest that Ciro Esposito viewed this trip differently. Like thousands of others, he boarded transportation to Rome, expecting to spend the evening inside Stadio Olimpico, supporting Napoli. He could not have anticipated that the stadium would remain forever out of reach. As buses approached Rome, the scale of the event became increasingly visible. Police vehicles escorted groups toward designated routes. Traffic intensified as supporters from different regions converged on the capital. Around the stadium, security operations expanded in preparation for the arrival of tens of thousands of spectators. On paper, the logistical arrangements appeared designed to minimize contact between rival groups. Authorities attempted to separate movements, reducing the likelihood that hostile supporters would encounter one another before entering the stadium. Such planning reflected lessons learned from previous incidents across Italian football. Nevertheless, maintaining complete separation among thousands of people moving simultaneously through an urban environment remained an enormous challenge. Roads intersected, crowds shifted unexpectedly, and isolated groups could appear in places where security planners had hoped they would not. According to the subsequent investigation, the critical location became Viale di Tor di Quinto, several kilometers from Stadio Olimpico. It was there that the carefully planned routine surrounding a major sporting event began to unravel. Before examining the confrontation itself, it is important to recognize that the atmosphere surrounding the final already contained two contrasting realities. On one hand were ordinary supporters like Ciro Esposito, individuals who had invested time and money simply to watch a football match. On the other were long-standing tensions involving organized ultras whose rivalries had developed. Over many years, these realities existed simultaneously. Most supporters had no intention of participating in violence. Yet the actions of relatively small groups possessed the potential to affect thousands of others. Caught nearby, this imbalance would become painfully clear on the evening of May 3rd. The significance of Ciro's story lies partly in the fact that he represented the ordinary supporter rather than the professional troublemaker often imagined in discussions about football violence. He worked an ordinary job. He returned home after work to family and friends. He followed his club because football formed part of his identity, not because confrontation defined his weekends. The distinction matters because public conversations about supporter violence frequently blur the line between extremist groups and the much larger population of peaceful fans who simply attend matches. In Ciro's case, available information consistently portrays him as belonging to that larger community. His presence in Rome reflected devotion to his club rather than participation in organized violence. As afternoon gradually turned toward evening, anticipation continued building throughout the capital. Inside Stadio Olimpico, preparations advanced toward kickoff. Players prepared mentally for one of the biggest matches of their season. Stadium staff finalized operational checks. Television broadcasters readied cameras that would soon transmit the final across Italy and beyond. Outside the stadium, however, events were beginning to move in a very different direction. Along the routes leading toward the venue, groups of supporters approached one another. Long-standing hostility, carefully managed but never completely eliminated, was about to collide with circumstance. Within minutes, the ordinary journey of one Napoli supporter named Ciro Esposito would intersect with one of the darkest episodes in modern Italian football history, transforming an anonymous working man from Scampia into a national symbol whose name would forever be associated not with the match he hoped to watch, but with the devastating consequences of violence before the game had even begun. As the afternoon of May 3rd, 2014 moved steadily toward evening, thousands of football supporters were converging on Rome from different parts of Italy. Every route leading toward the Stadio Olimpico carried the unmistakable signs of a major sporting occasion. Police vehicles escorted organized groups of supporters. Buses decorated with club colors arrived one after another. Streets that on an ordinary Saturday would have carried local traffic were instead filled with chants, flags, scarves, and the constant movement of crowds heading toward the National Stadium. For most of those present, the destination was clear. They expected to spend the evening inside the stadium watching the Coppa Italia final between SSC Napoli and ACF Fiorentina. Few imagined that the defining event of the day would occur long before the referee blew the opening whistle. Ciro Esposito was among the Napoli supporters making that journey. Like thousands of others wearing blue, he had traveled from Naples simply to support his club. There is nothing in the available evidence suggesting that he anticipated becoming involved in violence. Yet as supporters approached the area of Viale di Tor di Quinto, only a few kilometers from the stadium, the atmosphere began to change. The carefully managed separation of rival groups started to break down. According to the subsequent investigation, supporters from Napoli encountered a group of ultras associated with AS Roma. Although Roma was not even participating in the final, the long-standing hostility between certain ultras from the two clubs had been a concern for police planning before the event. Security measures had attempted to reduce the possibility of direct contact. But on that evening, the two groups came into close proximity. At first, the confrontation followed a pattern that had unfortunately become familiar during episodes of football-related disorder in Italy. Supporters shouted insults across the street. The verbal abuse quickly intensified. Soon afterward, objects began flying through the air. Witnesses later described bottles being thrown, followed by stones and other hard objects. Flares illuminated parts of the road with flashes of red light, while smoke devices filled sections of the area with thick clouds that reduced visibility. What only moments earlier had been an ordinary route toward a football match rapidly descended into confusion. People shouted warnings while others attempted to understand where the confrontation had started. The situation evolved so quickly that many individuals present had little opportunity to react before violence spread around them. Crowds rarely move in an orderly fashion once panic begins. Some supporters instinctively advanced toward the disturbance. Others immediately tried to escape. Still others froze, unable to determine where the danger actually was. The available evidence indicates that within only a few minutes the confrontation had grown beyond verbal hostility into physical violence involving numerous individuals. Police officers were confronted with the difficult task of controlling rapidly moving groups whose actions changed almost from second to second. It was within this atmosphere of disorder that investigators later identified the presence of Daniele De Santis, a Roma ultra known by the nickname Gaston. According to information presented during the investigation and subsequent trial, De Santis had previously been associated with football-related violence and had at different times attracted the attention of law enforcement. On May 3, 2014, investigators concluded that he was present near the scene of the confrontation carrying a handgun. Exactly how every participant moved during those chaotic moments would later become the subject of detailed examination by investigators and the courts. Witness testimony, surveillance material, forensic analysis, and ballistic evidence would all be used to reconstruct events as accurately as possible. Although individual witnesses described different perspectives, an expected consequence in a rapidly unfolding public disturbance, the broader sequence established by investigators remained consistent. As the confrontation intensified, DeSantis drew his handgun. Moments later, multiple shots were fired. The sound of gunfire instantly transformed what had already been a dangerous confrontation into something far more serious. Football supporters accustomed to hearing fireworks and flares suddenly found themselves reacting to the unmistakable report of a firearm. Panic spread almost immediately. Individuals who moments earlier had been shouting or running toward the confrontation now attempted to flee from it. Others searched frantically for friends and relatives who had disappeared into the confusion. According to investigators, 3 Napoli supporters were struck by the gunfire. They were Ciro Esposito, Alfonso Esposito, and Gennaro Fioretti. Among the 3 victims, Ciro suffered by far the most devastating injury. The subsequent forensic examination established that the bullet entered his body from behind at approximately body height. It passed through his lung, causing catastrophic internal injuries before coming to rest near his spine. The damage produced severe internal bleeding almost immediately. Doctors would later explain that the extent of the trauma placed his life in immediate danger from the moment he was struck. The violence of those few seconds permanently changed the course of his life. Medical personnel responding to the scene found Ciro critically injured and suffering massive blood loss. Every minute became essential. Emergency responders stabilized him as quickly as circumstances allowed before transporting him to the Policlinico Universitario Agostino Gemelli Hospital in Rome, one of the country's leading medical centers. Inside the ambulance, attention focused entirely on keeping him alive long enough to reach the operating room. Outside, confusion continued as police secured the area. Witnesses attempted to explain what they had seen, and investigators began preserving evidence that would later become central to a homicide investigation. At the hospital, trauma surgeons immediately recognized the severity of Ciro's injuries. The bullet's path through the lung had caused life-threatening damage. An emergency surgery began without delay. During the operation, doctors worked to stop the internal bleeding, remove severely damaged lung tissue, and stabilize injuries that threatened multiple vital functions. Massive blood transfusions became necessary. Intensive monitoring followed every stage of treatment. When the first operation concluded, Ciro remained alive, but his condition was described as extremely critical. The fact that he had survived long enough to reach surgery offered hope. Yet, no physician could guarantee recovery. News of the shooting spread rapidly across Italy. What had begun as reports of disorder before the Coppa Italia final quickly developed into breaking. National news centered on the condition of a gravely wounded supporter. Television broadcasts interrupted football coverage to provide updates from outside the hospital. Newspapers shifted their attention from match previews to medical bulletins. In Naples, anxiety spread through neighborhoods where many people knew only that one of their fellow supporters had been shot while traveling to watch the final. As hours turned into days, Ciro's struggle became increasingly public. Doctors continued intensive treatment while carefully monitoring complications arising from the gunshot wound. Surgical intervention had addressed the immediate injuries, but the damage inflicted by the bullet remained extensive. Infection emerged as a constant threat. Respiratory function required continuous support. Every improvement was balanced by new medical challenges. Rather than experiencing a straightforward recovery, Ciro entered a prolonged fight for survival that would last nearly 2 months. Throughout this period, his family remained almost constantly at the hospital. Their lives became organized around medical briefings, intensive care visiting hours, and cautious optimism whenever doctors reported even slight signs of progress. Public attention likewise remained focused on the hospital. Thousands of Napoli supporters expressed solidarity with Ciro and his relatives, hoping that the young man who had left home to watch a football match would eventually recover. Yet the reality inside the intensive care unit remained uncertain. Severe gunshot injuries frequently produce complications extending far beyond the initial trauma. And Ciro's case proved no exception. He underwent additional medical procedures as physicians attempted to control the consequences of the wound. Lung damage continued to affect his breathing. Infections repeatedly complicated treatment despite aggressive medical care. His condition fluctuated, creating alternating periods of hope and concern that were followed closely by the Italian public. During these weeks, one voice emerged that profoundly influenced how the tragedy would be remembered. Ciro's mother, Antonella Lirdi, faced the unimaginable experience of watching her son fight for his life, while the entire country followed every development. Yet despite the emotional weight of those circumstances, she repeatedly appealed for calm, rather than encouraging anger or revenge against rival supporters. She asked that no further violence be committed in Ciro's name. Her message was both simple and extraordinary. She insisted that another act of violence could never undo the suffering already inflicted upon her. Family. In a period when emotions ran high and tensions between rival groups threatened to intensify further, her words stood in sharp contrast to the atmosphere surrounding the case. Many Italians later viewed those appeals as one of the most remarkable aspects of the tragedy itself. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering evidence while doctors fought to preserve Ciro's life. These two efforts unfolded simultaneously, one inside police offices and laboratories, the other inside operating rooms and intensive care wards. Both were responses to the same event, yet only one still offered the possibility of changing its outcome. Unfortunately, despite every medical effort, the injuries proved too severe. Nearly 2 months after the shooting, complications continued to accumulate. The extensive trauma caused by the bullet eventually resulted in progressive organ failure that medical treatment could no longer reverse. On June 25, 2014, after approximately 53 days of hospitalization, Ciro Esposito died. The announcement marked the end of a struggle that had captured the attention of Italy since the evening of May 3rd. His death transformed the legal significance of the case, changing it from an investigation centered on attempted murder into one involving homicide. It also deepened the emotional impact felt throughout Naples and the wider football community. Thousands mourned not simply because a supporter had died, but because his death had followed weeks of hope that he might survive. A post-mortem examination later confirmed that the fatal injuries resulted directly from a gunshot wound. The forensic findings established that the bullet had been fired at body height, entered from behind, caused catastrophic damage to the lung, and ultimately led to the complications responsible for his death. Those medical conclusions would later become important pieces of evidence during the judicial proceedings. Yet beyond their legal significance, they reinforced a tragic reality. A journey intended to celebrate football had ended not inside a stadium, but inside a hospital. The 90 minutes of the Coppa Italia final eventually faded into sporting history. The 53 days that followed the shooting became something much more enduring, a reminder that violence surrounding sport can extend far beyond the boundaries of the game itself, leaving consequences measured not in goals or trophies, but in lives permanently changed and a family forever marked by a loss that began before the match had even begun. The death of Ciro Esposito marked the end of a 53-day medical battle, but it also signaled the beginning of another process that would take years to complete. While doctors had spent nearly 2 months attempting to save his life, investigators have been working in parallel to determine exactly what had happened on the evening of May 3, 2014 near Viale di Torquinto. Their responsibility extended beyond identifying suspect. They needed to reconstruct a chaotic series of events that had unfolded within minutes, involving large crowds, conflicting eyewitness accounts, physical violence, and the use of a firearm in an environment filled with confusion and panic. Every conclusion would have to be supported by evidence capable of withstanding careful judicial scrutiny. Unlike scenes involving only a handful of individuals, the confrontation before the Coppa Italia final presented investigators with extraordinary complexity. Hundreds of supporters had been moving through the area when violence erupted. Some had witnessed only fragments of the incident before running for safety. Others observed events from different angles. Memories formed under conditions of fear and confusion are rarely identical, and investigators understood that each statement represented only one perspective within a much larger picture. The first task was therefore to secure the scene and preserve every piece of physical evidence. Before crowds dispersed completely, officers collected witness statements from people who remained nearby after the shooting. Some described hearing shouting before seeing objects thrown through the air. Others remembered the moment gunfire interrupted the confrontation, causing immediate panic among everyone present. Investigators documented these accounts carefully, recognizing that individual recollections would later need to be compared with one another and tested against forensic findings rather than accepted in isolation. Physical evidence quickly became just as important as eyewitness testimony. Specialists examined the area where the shooting had occurred, searching for ballistic evidence capable of reconstructing the sequence of events. They analyzed the firearm connected to the case, documented gunshot residue, and examined the trajectory of the bullets. Every recovered item contributed another piece to the developing reconstruction. Unlike eyewitness memory, ballistic evidence does not depend upon emotion or perception. It provides measurable information regarding the weapon used, the direction of fire, and the path traveled by each projectile. For investigators, these scientific findings would become essential in evaluating competing versions of what had happened. One of the earliest developments in the investigation was the identification of Daniele DeSantis as the principal suspect. According to investigators, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the examination of the firearm all pointed toward his involvement in the shooting. DeSantis was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. Information available during the investigation indicated that he had previously been associated with football-related violence and had attracted police attention in connection with earlier incidents involving ultras. Although prior history alone could never establish guilt for a new offense, investigators considered it part of the broader context surrounding his presence near the confrontation on May 3rd. Once identified, every available piece of evidence concerning his actions during the incident became subject to detailed examination. The investigation did not rely upon a single witness or one decisive discovery. Instead, prosecutors gradually assembled what they argued was a consistent body of evidence drawn from multiple independent sources. Witnesses who had observed portions of the confrontation were interviewed extensively. Their descriptions were compared to identify areas of agreement and disagreement. Investigators also examined surveillance material and other visual recordings captured near the scene. Such recordings could not always show every critical moment with complete clarity, but they provided valuable reference points that helped establish movements, timing, and the relative positions of individuals before and after the shooting. These recordings were evaluated together with forensic evidence rather than treated as standalone proof. Meanwhile, Ciro Esposito himself became an important source of evidence while he was still alive, during periods in which his medical condition allowed communication. He spoke with relatives and investigators about the shooting. According to the case file, he identified Daniele DeSantis as the individual who had fired the shots. These statements carried particular significance because they came from the victim himself before his death. Investigators did not rely upon those statements alone. Instead, they treated them as one component within a broader evidentiary framework that also included witness testimony, ballistic analysis, and other forensic findings. Nevertheless, Ciro's identification of the alleged shooter became one of the most closely discussed elements of the investigation and was later presented during judicial proceedings as part of the prosecution's overall case. As forensic specialists continued their examination, the medical evidence also assumed increasing importance. Doctors treating Ciro documented the injuries caused by the gunshot, while later forensic examinations analyzed the trajectory of the fatal bullet. The conclusions proved highly significant. According to the forensic findings, the projectile had been fired at approximately body height. It entered Ciro's body from behind, passed through the lung, caused catastrophic internal injuries, and ultimately led to the complications that resulted in his death nearly 2 months later. For prosecutors, the trajectory of the bullet represented an important factual element because it helped reconstruct the circumstances under which the shot had been fired. The medical findings were consistent with the severe injuries observed during treatment and later, confirmed through post-mortem examination. Every detail concerning the bullet's path became relevant when evaluating competing legal interpretations of the shooting. As the investigation progressed, the defense advanced a markedly different account of the confrontation. According to Daniele DeSantis, he had been surrounded by a large group of Napoli supporters during the violence near Viale di Torquinto. The defense argued that he had been attacked with bricks and metal objects and believed his life to be in immediate danger. Within that version of events, the firearm was used in self-defense rather than as part of an unlawful attack. Self-defense is a recognized legal principle under Italian criminal law, but its application depends upon strict conditions concerning necessity and proportionality. Consequently, investigators and prosecutors were required to determine not merely whether DeSantis felt threatened, but whether the available evidence supported the legal requirements necessary to justify the use of deadly force. Prosecutors ultimately rejected the self-defense explanation. Their position rested upon the cumulative weight of the evidence gathered during the investigation, rather than any single finding. They argued that witness testimony, ballistic analysis, medical evidence, and the available visual material did not support the conclusion that the shooting constituted lawful self-defense. Particular attention focused on the trajectory of the fatal shot, the circumstances under which the firearm had been discharged, and the overall sequence reconstructed through the investigation. According to the prosecution, the use of a handgun fired at body height against individuals in the crowd could not be reconciled with the legal standards governing self-defense in the circumstances established by the evidence. This disagreement became the central legal issue of the case. Investigators were therefore tasked not only with identifying who had fired the weapon, but also with documenting every circumstance surrounding its use. Ballistics experts explained the technical characteristics of the firearm and ammunition. Medical specialists described the injuries sustained by all 3 victims. Police officers who had responded to the scene provided detailed accounts regarding the condition of the area after the shooting. Witnesses described what they had observed immediately before and after the gunfire. Each category of evidence addressed different aspects of the same event, and prosecutors sought to demonstrate that together they formed a coherent narrative supported by objective findings. At the same time, Investigators remained aware that the defense would challenge many of those conclusions during trial. Every statement had to be verified wherever possible. Every forensic report required careful documentation. Every item of physical evidence had to maintain an unbroken chain of custody to ensure its admissibility in court. High-profile criminal cases often attract intense public attention, but investigators cannot allow public opinion to replace evidentiary standards. In the Esposito investigation, national media coverage remained extensive throughout the medical treatment after Ciro's death and during the months that followed. Despite that attention, prosecutors still bore the burden of proving the charges through admissible evidence rather than public sentiment. As months passed, the investigation gradually reached the stage where prosecutors believed sufficient evidence existed to proceed with formal criminal charges. Daniele DeSantis was indicted in connection with the death of Ciro Esposito. The shootings that injured Alfonso Esposito and Gennaro Fioretti and related weapons offenses. The investigation had transformed thousands of pages of witness statements, forensic reports, ballistic examinations, medical documentation, and physical evidence into a legal case prepared for judicial examination. Yet an investigation does not determine guilt. Its purpose is to gather and organize evidence so that an independent court can evaluate competing arguments under the law. The next phase would therefore shift from police offices and forensic laboratories to the courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would present their respective interpretations before judges responsible for reaching a verdict based solely on the evidence. For Ciro Esposito's family, however, no judicial proceeding could reverse what had already happened. The investigation could identify responsibility and establish accountability, but it could not restore the ordinary life that had ended on a road leading to a football stadium. What remained was the pursuit of legal justice, a process that would ultimately determine whether the evidence assembled over months of meticulous investigation was sufficient to establish criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. By the time the criminal proceedings began, the case of Ciro Esposito had already become far more than a single homicide investigation. Nearly every major stage of the tragedy had unfolded under intense public scrutiny. The shooting itself had occurred only hours before one of Italy's most important football matches. Ciro's prolonged struggle for survival had been followed by countless supporters, journalists, and ordinary citizens. His death, after approximately 53 days in intensive medical care, transformed widespread concern into national mourning. At the same time, his mother's repeated appeals against revenge had altered the public conversation surrounding the case, encouraging many people to focus not on retaliation, but on accountability through the justice system. As the proceedings moved into the courtroom, expectations were understandably high. For Ciro's family, the trial represented an opportunity to establish legal responsibility for the loss they had suffered. For the defense, it was the forum in which Daniele DeSantis would challenge the prosecution's reconstruction of events and argue that his actions had occurred under circumstances of self-defense. For the judges, however, public emotion could not replace evidence. The responsibility of the court was to evaluate every factual element presented during the investigation and determine whether the prosecution had proven the charges under Italian criminal law. The indictment against Daniele DeSantis reflected the seriousness of the incident. Prosecutors charged him with the murder of Ciro Esposito following the victim's death from complications caused by the gunshot wound. In addition to the homicide charge, he also faced charges relating to the attempted murder of the two other Napoli supporters wounded during the shooting, Alfonso Esposito and Gennaro Fioretti. The prosecution further included offenses connected to the use of the firearm during the confrontation. Together, These charges reflected the investigators' conclusion that the shooting had not been an isolated injury to a single victim, but an attack that endangered multiple individuals during the violent encounter near Viale di Tor di Quinto. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors relied upon the body of evidence assembled during the investigation. Witness testimony formed one important component of their case. Numerous individuals had described the confrontation that preceded the shooting, although, as expected in situations involving large crowds and rapidly unfolding violence, not every witness observed the incident from exactly the same perspective. Rather than depending upon one account alone, prosecutors sought to demonstrate that the collective testimony, when viewed alongside forensic findings and physical evidence, established a consistent reconstruction of the events. The prosecution also relied heavily on the scientific evidence gathered after the shooting. Ballistic examinations connected the firearm to the incident, while forensic specialists analyzed the trajectory of the bullets fired during the confrontation. Medical evidence documented the devastating injuries sustained by Ciro Esposito and confirmed that the bullet had entered his body from behind at approximately body height, passed through his lung, and ultimately caused the medical complications that resulted in his death. These findings were not merely technical details. They played an essential role in helping the court evaluate how the shooting had occurred and whether the use of deadly force could be legally justified. Another significant element of the prosecution's case involved statements made by Ciro himself while he remained hospitalized, during periods in which his medical condition allowed communication. He identified Daniele DeSantis as the man who had shot him. Prosecutors presented these statements as part of a broader evidentiary framework rather than as standalone proof. They argued that Ciro's identification was consistent with witness testimony, forensic findings, ballistic analysis, and the overall reconstruction established during the investigation. In criminal proceedings, courts generally evaluate evidence not in isolation but in combination, examining whether multiple independent sources support one another. The prosecution maintained that this cumulative approach reinforced the reliability of its case. Against DeSantis, the defense, however, presented a fundamentally different interpretation of the confrontation. According to DeSantis, the events near Viale di Tor di Quinto had placed him in immediate danger. The defense argued that he had been surrounded by a large group of Napoli supporters and attacked with bricks and metal objects during the violence. From this perspective, the firearm had been discharged as an act of self-defense rather than an unlawful assault. Self-defense occupies an important place within criminal law because legal systems recognize that individuals may sometimes use force when confronted with an imminent threat. However, such claims require careful judicial examination. The existence of danger alone is not sufficient. Courts must also determine whether the force used was necessary, proportionate, and legally justified under the specific circumstances established by the evidence. Consequently, the central issue before the court was not simply whether violence had occurred before the shooting. That fact was largely undisputed. The confrontation between rival supporters had already been documented through witness testimony and other evidence. Instead, the crucial legal question concerned whether the firing of the handgun satisfied the legal requirements for self-defense. Prosecutors argued that it did not. They maintained that the forensic evidence, witness statements, and reconstruction of the incident demonstrated that the use of deadly force could not be justified under the circumstances. Particular emphasis was placed upon the trajectory of the fatal bullet and the manner in which the firearm had been used. According to the prosecution, these objective findings contradicted the defense's interpretation of lawful self-defense. Throughout the proceedings, the judges were required to consider every category of evidence presented before reaching their conclusions. Witnesses described what they had observed before and after the shooting. Investigators explained how the crime scene had been examined and how physical evidence had been preserved. Ballistics experts presented technical analyses concerning the firearm and projectile trajectories. Medical specialists described the nature of Ciro Esposito's injuries and explained how those injuries directly resulted in the complications that caused his death nearly 2 months later. Together, these various forms of evidence allowed the court to evaluate the prosecution's reconstruction against the defense's alternative explanation. The trial, therefore, became an exercise not in emotion, but in legal analysis. Although public sympathy for Ciro and his family remained substantial, the judges were required to separate emotional response from evidentiary assessment. Their responsibility was to determine whether the prosecution had established criminal responsibility according to the standards required by law. Every piece of evidence had to be weighed for credibility, consistency, and reliability. Contradictions had to be examined carefully. Competing interpretations required objective evaluation. This methodical process is a defining characteristic of criminal justice, particularly in cases attracting widespread public attention. In 2016, after examining the evidence presented throughout the proceedings, the court reached its decision. Daniele DeSantis was convicted of the murder of Ciro Esposito, the attempted murders of Alfonso Esposito and Gennaro Fioretti, and the related offenses connected to the violent incident. The judges rejected the defense argument that the shooting constituted lawful self-defense, concluding instead that the evidence supported the prosecution's reconstruction of events. The court sentenced DeSantis to 26 years imprisonment. The verdict represented the legal conclusion of the trial court's examination of the evidence assembled during the investigation. Yet the judicial process did not end with the initial conviction. As is common in serious criminal cases, the defense pursued appeals through the Italian court system. Appellate proceedings provided additional opportunities for the legal arguments and evidentiary record to be reviewed. Higher courts examined whether the trial had been conducted properly and whether the legal conclusions reached by the lower court were supported by the evidence. Following these reviews, the conviction and the 26-year sentence were upheld. The appellate decisions left the original judgment intact, confirming the legal responsibility established during the trial. For Ciro Esposito's family, no sentence could restore what had been taken from them. Criminal justice can establish accountability, but it cannot erase loss or reverse death. Nevertheless, the verdict provided an official legal acknowledgement that responsibility for the shooting had been determined through judicial examination rather than public speculation. For the broader Italian public, the conclusion of the criminal proceedings represented another important chapter in a case that had already changed national discussions about football violence. The court's decision reinforced the principle that acts of extreme violence occurring in connection with sporting events would be addressed through the ordinary mechanisms of criminal law, regardless of the emotions surrounding football rivalries. Yet even after the appeals concluded and the sentence became final, many observers recognized that the significance of the case extended beyond the courtroom itself. The legal proceedings had answered the question of criminal responsibility, but they had also exposed deeper concerns about supporter violence, public safety, and the influence of extremist ultras within Italian football. Those broader issues would continue to shape discussions long after the judges delivered their verdict. The legacy of Ciro Esposito would therefore be measured not only by the outcome of one criminal trial, but also by the lasting changes that followed throughout Italian football, where his name came to symbolize both the devastating human cost of violence and the determination of a grieving family, especially his mother, Antonella Lirdi, to reject hatred in favor of justice, restraint, and the hope that no other family would experience the same tragedy again. The legal proceedings eventually reached their conclusion. The investigation had reconstructed the events surrounding the shooting. The courts had examined witness testimony, forensic reports, ballistic evidence, medical findings, and competing legal arguments before determining criminal responsibility. Daniele DeSantis had been convicted, sentenced to 26 years imprisonment, and that judgment was upheld through the appellate process. From the perspective of the justice system, the case had reached its legal endpoint. Yet for the people whose lives had been permanently altered by the events of May 3, 2014, there could never be a true conclusion. Court judgments establish accountability, but they do not erase absence. They cannot restore a son to his parents, return an ordinary working man to his neighborhood, or allow a football supporter to finish the journey that had begun with such ordinary expectations on the morning of the Coppa Italia final. Long after the courtroom fell silent, the consequences of Ciro Esposito's death continued to ripple across Italian society, changing not only the lives of his family, but also the way Italy thought about safety, football culture, and the responsibilities shared by clubs, supporters, and public authorities. In Naples, the news of Ciro's death on June 25, 2014, was received with profound sadness. For nearly 53 days, thousands of people had followed every medical update from the Policlinico Universitario Agostino Gemelli Hospital in Rome. Hope had survived through multiple surgeries, intensive care treatment, and occasional reports suggesting slight improvements in his condition. Each encouraging medical bulletin had inspired renewed optimism that he might eventually recover. Despite the catastrophic injuries caused by the gunshot wound, each setback reminded the public that the danger had never disappeared. When confirmation finally came that Ciro had died from multiple organ failure resulting from the injuries he had sustained, the sense of loss extended far beyond his immediate family. Many people who had never met him nevertheless felt connected to his struggle because they had witnessed it unfold day after day. The funeral and public mourning reflected that connection. Ciro Esposito was no longer remembered simply as an individual supporter of SSC Napoli. He had become a symbol of every ordinary fan who attends a football match expecting nothing more than an afternoon or evening devoted to the game. His story demonstrated how quickly that expectation could be destroyed when violence escaped control. The tragedy resonated because it illustrated a painful truth that transcended football itself. Sporting rivalries are meant to remain within the boundaries of competition. Once hatred extends beyond those boundaries and enters public streets carrying real weapons, the consequences are measured not in victories or defeats, but in human lives. Among the many responses that followed Ciro's death, none attracted greater respect than those expressed by his mother, Antonella Lirdi. Throughout her son's hospitalization, she had repeatedly urged supporters not to seek revenge. After his death, those appeals did not disappear. Instead, they became one of the defining moral legacies of the case. Her position was remarkable precisely because it emerged from the deepest personal grief imaginable. No one would have questioned her anger. No one would have been surprised had she demanded retaliation or spoken with bitterness toward those responsible. Instead, she consistently rejected the idea that another act of violence could honor her son's memory. She insisted that Ciro should never become an excuse for further bloodshed. Her words challenged one of the most destructive patterns often associated with cycles of violence, the belief that one tragedy must inevitably produce another. Rather than allowing grief to become fuel for renewed hostility between rival groups of supporters, she argued that the only meaningful response was to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. In doing so, Antonella Lirdi became a respected public voice far beyond Naples. Many Italians viewed her not only as the mother of a victim, but also as a powerful advocate for reconciliation and responsibility. She later participated in initiatives intended to raise awareness about the dangers of football-related extremism and met with families affected by other acts of violence connected to sport. Her public role demonstrated that remembrance need not depend upon anger. It could instead become a force encouraging dialogue, education, and a renewed commitment to protecting future generations of supporters. The influence of Ciro Esposito's case also extended into Italian football policy. Although violence involving ultras had existed for decades before 2014, the shooting highlighted vulnerabilities that authorities could no longer ignore. The fact that the attack occurred before the match, several kilometers from the stadium itself, demonstrated that security planning could not focus exclusively on events inside sporting venues. Large football occasions involve the movement of tens of thousands of supporters through cities, transportation networks, parking areas, and public roads. Effective safety, therefore, requires attention to every stage of that journey rather than only the 90 minutes played on the field. Following the case, Italian authorities strengthened security measures surrounding matches considered to carry elevated risks. The segregation of supporters received greater emphasis, with increased efforts to separate rival groups before they could encounter one another. Police deployment around stadiums and surrounding routes became more extensive during high-risk fixtures. Crowd management procedures were reviewed and reinforced in an effort to reduce opportunities for violent confrontation. Greater attention was also directed toward monitoring and managing organized ultras groups whose activities had repeatedly contributed to public disorder. None of these measures could guarantee that violence would disappear entirely. Football, like society itself, cannot be made completely free from conflict. Nevertheless, the changes reflected an acknowledgement that existing arrangements required improvement. Ciro Esposito's death became one of the events frequently cited when discussing why stronger preventive measures were necessary. The case also encouraged broader public debate concerning the place of ultras within Italian football culture. Most football supporters attend matches peacefully, motivated by loyalty to their clubs, enjoyment of the sport, and a shared experience of supporting their teams alongside family and friends. Yet a relatively small number of extremist groups have historically exerted influence disproportionate to their size, often dominating public attention through acts of intimidation and violence. The tragedy surrounding Ciro forced many observers to distinguish more clearly between these groups, and the overwhelming majority of supporters who reject such behavior. That distinction mattered because allowing violence to define football culture unfairly overshadowed the millions of peaceful supporters whose passion for the game has never involved criminal conduct. Ciro himself represented that larger community. According to the information available throughout the investigation, he was an ordinary worker from Scampia who loved his club, traveled to away matches, and had no record suggesting involvement in organized violence. His life illustrated the reality that victims of football-related violence are often supporters, whose only intention is to watch their team play. This understanding gradually reshaped the way many Italians discuss the case. Rather than viewing it solely as another confrontation between rival ultras, increasing attention focused on the ordinary individual whose future had been stolen before he even reached the stadium. Looking back years after the events of May and June 2014, one aspect of the case remains especially striking. The football match that originally brought thousands of supporters to Rome eventually became a historical footnote within the larger narrative. Results, trophies, and celebrations inevitably fade as seasons pass and new competitions begin. The story of Ciro Esposito endured because it touched something more fundamental than sport. It asked difficult questions about how society defines loyalty, rivalry, and identity. It challenged supporters to consider where passion ends and fanaticism begins. It reminded public authorities that effective security planning must extend beyond stadium walls. Most importantly, it demonstrated the irreversible consequences that follow when a moment of uncontrolled violence intersects with the life of an ordinary person. The investigation, the trial, and the appeals all served essential purposes within the justice system. They established accountability based upon evidence and affirmed the rule of law. Yet the most enduring legacy of the case cannot be measured solely through judicial decisions or years of imprisonment. Its deeper significance lies in the conversations it inspired across Italy. Supporters, clubs, journalists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens were compelled to confront uncomfortable realities about violence associated with football. They debated how such tragedies could be prevented, how extremist behavior should be addressed, and how sporting passion might be preserved without allowing hatred to flourish alongside it. Those discussions continue to influence Italian football today. The name Ciro Esposito, therefore, occupies a unique place in the history of Italian sport. He is remembered not because he scored a decisive goal, lifted a trophy, or became a celebrated athlete. He is remembered because his death exposed the devastating cost of violence carried out in the name of football. His 53-day struggle for survival transformed him into a symbol of resilience, while his mother's extraordinary refusal to embrace revenge transformed the family's response into a lesson in dignity and humanity. Together, their story reminds us that the true measure of sport is not found in victories recorded on scoreboards, but in the values preserved beyond the final whistle. A football match lasts only a few hours. A criminal trial may last several years. But the consequences of one violent decision can endure for generations, shaping public memory long after the chants have faded. The stadium lights have been switched off, and the final result has been forgotten. On the afternoon of May 3rd, 2014, Ciro Esposito left Naples expecting to watch his beloved Napoli compete for a national trophy. He never entered Stadio Olimpico. Instead, his journey became one of the defining tragedies in modern Italian football history, a lasting reminder that the greatest threat to the spirit of sport has never been defeat on the field, but the willingness of human beings to allow hatred to eclipse the very game they claim to love. More than a decade has passed since the events of May 3rd, 2014. Yet the name Ciro Esposito continues to occupy a unique place in the collective memory of Italian football. Time has brought new champions, new finals, new rivalries, and countless unforgettable moments on the pitch. But the tragedy that unfolded outside Rome's Stadio Olimpico remains one of the defining reminders that football's greatest dangers do not always emerge during the match itself. Unlike victories that are eventually replaced by new triumphs or defeats that gradually fade into history, Ciro's story has endured because it represents something larger than a single criminal case. It has become a lasting symbol of the human cost of violence committed in the name of sport, and a reminder that every supporter arriving at a stadium is first and foremost a human being with a family, a future, and a life beyond football. The legal process ultimately answered the central question of criminal responsibility. Investigators reconstructed the events, prosecutors presented their case. The courts evaluated the available evidence, and Daniele De Santis was convicted and sentenced for the crimes arising from the shooting. From the perspective of the justice system, accountability had been established through due process. Yet justice in criminal law is necessarily limited. It can identify responsibility, impose punishment, and reaffirm the rule of law. But it cannot restore the ordinary future that was taken from Ciro Esposito. His family continued living with an absence that no verdict could erase. Friends who had expected to share future matches with him instead carried memories of a journey that, ended in tragedy. The city of Naples lost one of its countless ordinary supporters, a man who had become extraordinary only because violence interrupted an otherwise ordinary life. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the case lies not in the courtroom, but in the response of Ciro's mother, Antonella Leardi. Throughout her son's hospitalization and after his death, she consistently urged supporters not to seek revenge. In a country where football rivalries have too often produced cycles of retaliation, her refusal to allow grief to become another source of hatred resonated deeply with the Italian public. Many observers regarded her response as an extraordinary demonstration of moral strength. Rather than allowing her son's death to deepen divisions between rival groups of supporters, she insisted that his memory should instead encourage reflection, responsibility, and peace. Her words shifted the focus of public discussion away from vengeance and toward prevention. They reminded countless Italians that the purpose of remembering a tragedy should never be to justify another one. In the years following the case, Ciro Esposito's story increasingly came to represent not only the dangers posed by violent ultras, but also the countless ordinary supporters who attend football matches peacefully every week. The overwhelming majority of football fans travel to stadiums with no intention of participating in disorder. They bring children, relatives, and lifelong friends to celebrate a shared passion for the game. They argue over tactics, celebrate victories, and endure defeats. But they expect to return home safely once the match ends. Ciro embodied that expectation. He worked at a car wash, lived an ordinary life in Scampia, and traveled to Rome because he loved Napoli. His story reminded Italy that victims of football violence are often not those seeking confrontation, but those whose ordinary lives happen to intersect with the actions of a small number of individuals, willing to abandon every principle of sport. The case also influenced how major football events have been organized in Italy. Authorities strengthened security planning around high-risk matches, paying greater attention not only to the stadium itself, but also to transportation routes, gathering points, and the movement of organized supporter groups before kickoff. The tragedy demonstrated that dangerous confrontations can develop far from the pitch, requiring comprehensive planning that extends across an entire city rather than ending at the stadium gates. Although no security strategy can eliminate every possible risk, the reforms introduced after the shooting reflected an acknowledgement that lessons have been learned through painful experience. Beyond practical changes, however, the legacy of Ciro Esposito continues to exist in public memory because his story forces difficult questions that remain relevant today. How should football supporters express passion without allowing loyalty to become hostility? What responsibilities do clubs, authorities, and supporters themselves share in protecting the game from those who seek confrontation rather than competition? How can sporting traditions built upon fierce rivalries preserve their intensity while rejecting violence completely? These questions extend beyond Italy. Football throughout the world has repeatedly demonstrated its ability both to unite communities and, at times, to expose deep social divisions. The challenge has never been eliminating rivalry, because rivalry is part of what gives competitive sport its emotional power. The challenge is ensuring that rivalry ends where sport begins, allowing competition to remain symbolic rather than physical. Ciro Esposito's death illustrates what happens when that boundary disappears. Looking back, one striking aspect of the case is how completely it overshadowed the sporting event that initially brought everyone together. The 2014 Coppa Italia final was intended to be remembered for football. Instead, history recalls it primarily because of the violence that preceded it. This reversal serves as a powerful reminder that acts of hatred possess the ability to eclipse even the greatest sporting achievements. Goals become statistics, Trophy celebrations become archival footage. But the image of a young supporter fighting for his life after traveling to watch his team has remained embedded in Italy's national memory. Ultimately, the legacy of Ciro Esposito is not defined solely by tragedy. It is also defined by resilience, dignity, and the refusal of his family to answer violence with more violence. His 53-day struggle for survival united supporters across traditional rivalries in hope. His mother's unwavering commitment to peace demonstrated that compassion can survive even after unimaginable loss. Together, their story transformed a criminal case into a broader lesson about humanity. Football has always claimed to bring people together across generations, neighborhoods, and cultures. The death of Ciro Esposito challenged everyone connected to the sport to ask whether that promise could still be fulfilled if violence continued to exist alongside it. More than a decade later, his name continues to remind Italy that the true victory is not simply winning a final or lifting a trophy, but ensuring that every supporter who sets out to watch a match has the opportunity to return home safely. That aspiration remains the most meaningful tribute to Ciro Esposito's memory and the enduring lesson left by one of the most significant tragedies in modern Italian football history. Even after the investigation ended, the appeals were exhausted, and the legal judgment became final. The story of Ciro Esposito continued to evolve in a different way. Criminal cases eventually leave the courtroom, but some remain alive in public memory because they force an entire society to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Ciro's case became one of those rare moments in modern Italian history when a single act of violence prompted people to ask questions that extended far beyond the identity of the offender or the details of the crime scene. It challenged the culture surrounding football, the responsibilities of supporters, the limits of rivalry, and the role of every institution entrusted with protecting public safety. Years later, discussions about violence in Italian football still return to the events of May 3, 2014, because the tragedy demonstrated that the consequences of hatred are never confined to the individuals directly involved. They spread outward, affecting families, communities, public policy, and even the identity of the sport itself. One of the most striking aspects of Ciro Esposito's story is the contrast between the simplicity of the life he lived and the magnitude of the legacy he left behind. Before May 2014, he was known only to relatives, friends, colleagues at the car wash where he worked, and fellow Napoli supporters who traveled with him to away matches. He was not a famous athlete, a public official, or a media personality. His daily routine resembled that of countless working-class Italians whose lives revolve around family, work, and weekend football. There is something profoundly unsettling about recognizing how quickly such an ordinary existence can become part of national history. One ordinary Saturday morning, Ciro boarded transportation to Rome, expecting nothing more than an evening supporting his favorite club. Before the match even began, everything changed forever. His story reminds us that victims are rarely prepared for the moments that define them in public memory. They leave home believing they will return, unaware that history has already chosen them. The long period between the shooting and Ciro's death also shaped the emotional impact of the case. Had he died immediately, the tragedy would undoubtedly have shocked Italy. But the nearly 2 months he spent in intensive care transformed the event into something different. Every day that he remained alive became another day of hope for his family and for thousands of people following the case. Every medical update was reported across national media. Every indication of improvement encouraged optimism that perhaps the worst outcome might somehow be avoided. Yet each new complication served as a reminder of how devastating the injuries truly were. The country experienced the tragedy gradually rather than all at once. Italians watched a young man fight for survival day after day, and that prolonged struggle created an emotional connection unlike many other criminal cases. When Ciro eventually died from multiple organ failure caused by the gunshot wound, it felt not only like the loss of one individual, but also the end of a battle that countless people had hoped he would win. Equally significant was the way his family chose to respond to unimaginable grief. Throughout history, violence has often generated demands for revenge. Communities divided by rivalry sometimes become trapped in cycles where each new victim becomes justification for another act of retaliation. Antonella Leardy refused to accept that logic. Her repeated appeals asking supporters not to seek revenge became one of the defining moral moments associated with the entire case. Rather than encouraging hatred toward rival supporters, she consistently argued that violence committed in her son's name would only create new victims and new families forced to endure the same suffering. Those statements carried extraordinary weight because they came from the person who arguably possessed the greatest reason to speak with anger. Instead, she chose compassion over vengeance. In doing so, she fundamentally influenced how the public remembered Ciro Esposito. His name became associated not only with tragedy, but also with dignity, restraint, and the possibility of breaking cycles of hatred. That response resonated well beyond football. Schools, community organizations, journalists, and civic leaders frequently pointed to Antonella Leardy's words when discussing conflict resolution, public responsibility, and the importance of rejecting violence even during moments of profound personal loss. Her example demonstrated that strength is not always expressed through confrontation. Sometimes it is revealed through the refusal to continue a conflict that has already caused irreversible harm. In many respects, her voice became as enduring as the legal judgment itself. The influence of the case also extended into practical discussions about public safety. Authorities recognized that the traditional focus on stadium security alone was insufficient. Football matches do not begin when players enter the pitch, nor do they end when the final whistle blows. Supporters travel across cities, gather in public spaces, and move through transportation networks long before kickoff. The shooting near Viale di Tor di Quinto illustrated that danger could emerge during any stage of that journey. As a result, greater attention was directed toward escorting supporter groups, separating rival fans, strengthening surveillance around high-risk events, and improving coordination among law enforcement agencies responsible for managing large sporting occasions. These measures reflected lessons drawn directly from the tragedy rather than abstract theoretical concerns. Although no security strategy can eliminate every risk, the reforms acknowledged that preventing future violence required planning beyond the stadium gates. The broader conversation surrounding ultras also intensified after the case. Italian football has long possessed one of the most passionate supporter cultures in the world. Choreographed displays, elaborate banners, songs, and unwavering loyalty have become defining characteristics of the sport in Italy. Yet alongside that passion, a minority of organized ultras groups have repeatedly attracted attention because of violent behavior, intimidation, and confrontations with rival supporters. Ciro Esposito's death forced many Italians to separate these two realities more clearly. Passion itself was never the problem. Loyalty to a football club was never the problem. The problem emerged when identity became inseparable from hostility and when human life became secondary to tribal conflict. Most supporters rejected that mentality completely, and Ciro represented precisely that majority. His story reminded the public that ordinary supporters often become the greatest victims whenever extremist behavior dominates football culture. Another enduring aspect of the case is how it altered the historical memory of the 2014 Coppa Italia. final itself. Football history usually remembers finals because of goals, tactics, dramatic moments, or championship celebrations. In this instance, however, discussions of the match almost inevitably begin with the events that occurred outside the stadium before kickoff. The sporting contest became inseparable from the tragedy that preceded it. This transformation illustrates the extraordinary power of violence to overshadow achievement. The players who prepared for months to reach the final ultimately found their accomplishment, eclipsed by an event entirely unrelated to football itself. It serves as a reminder that violence not only destroys individual lives, but also changes how history remembers moments that were originally intended to celebrate sport. Looking back today, Ciro Esposito's legacy cannot be measured solely by the legal outcome of the case or by the security reforms introduced afterward. His legacy exists in every discussion emphasizing that football must remain a place where competition replaces conflict rather than encourages it. It exists whenever supporters from opposing clubs recognize one another first as fellow human beings, instead of enemies. It exists whenever organizers place public safety at the center of planning for major sporting events. Most importantly, it exists in the understanding that every person traveling to a football match carries with them a life extending far beyond 90 minutes of sport. They have families waiting at home, friends expecting their return, careers, dreams, responsibilities, and futures that deserve protection regardless of club allegiance. Ciro Esposito's journey to Rome began with the simple intention of supporting Napoli in one of the biggest matches of the season. That journey never reached its intended destination. Instead, it became one of the defining tragedies of modern Italian football and a lasting reminder that no rivalry, no tradition, and no sporting passion can ever justify the loss of a human life. His story endures because it asks every generation of supporters to remember why football matters in the first place. At its best, the game brings strangers together, creates shared memories, strengthens communities, and inspires hope across generations. Whenever violence threatens those ideals, the memory of Ciro Esposito stands as a solemn warning of what can happen when the values that make sport meaningful are abandoned. In that sense, his legacy belongs not only to Napoli, not only to Italy, but to everyone who believes that the greatest victory in any sporting event is ensuring that every supporter, regardless of the colors they wear, returns home safely when the match is over. Every true crime story eventually reaches a point where the facts have all been presented. The investigation has been completed, the evidence has been examined. The courtroom arguments have ended, and the verdict has become part of the historical record. What remains after that is memory. Memory is different from evidence because it is carried not by documents or legal files, but by people. It survives in families who continue to celebrate birthdays without someone they loved. It lives in friends who instinctively expect to see a familiar face before remembering that it will never appear again. It persists in communities that gradually transform individual tragedies into shared history. The story of Ciro Esposito belongs to that kind of memory. Although the legal questions surrounding his death have been answered, the emotional and social questions raised by the case continue to resonate because they concern values far larger than one criminal investigation. They concern the relationship between passion and responsibility, between rivalry and respect, and between justice and humanity. Looking back at the entire sequence of events, one detail remains almost impossible to ignore. Ciro Esposito never set out to become a symbol. On the morning of May 3, 2014, he was simply another Napoli supporter traveling to Rome for the Coppa Italia final. Thousands of other supporters made the same journey that day. Most expected nothing more extraordinary than 90 minutes of football followed by the long trip home. Like so many ordinary people who unexpectedly become victims of violent crime, Ciro had no reason to believe that history would remember his name. The fact that it does today reflects not something extraordinary that he chose to do, but the extraordinary consequences of an act of violence committed against him. That realization carries an important lesson. Behind every widely reported criminal case is usually an individual whose daily life before the tragedy looked remarkably similar to that of countless others. The headlines often emphasize the crime, but the person at the center of the story was first a son, a friend, a worker, and a football supporter whose future was expected to unfold in ordinary ways. Remembering that humanity prevents true crime from becoming merely a collection of dramatic events. It reminds us that every victim leaves behind relationships, routines, ambitions, and dreams that disappear together with the life that has been lost. Throughout Ciro's 53-day struggle in hospital, Italy witnessed another aspect of tragedy that statistics can never fully capture. Medical reports described surgeries, damaged organs, infections, respiratory failure, and intensive care treatment. Those clinical terms accurately explained the physical reality of his condition. Yet they could never express what those weeks meant for the people waiting outside the intensive care unit. Every telephone call from doctors carried the possibility of either hope or devastating news. Every visit became precious because no one knew whether another opportunity would come. Every small sign of improvement encouraged renewed optimism, only for fresh complications to remind everyone how fragile recovery remained. For families living through such experiences, time changes completely. Days are no longer measured by ordinary routines, but by medical updates, consultations, and the uncertain passage from one hour to the next. The prolonged nature of Ciro's hospitalization allowed the entire country to witness that uncertainty. His death was not only the consequence of a gunshot wound, but also the conclusion of a public struggle for survival that many people had desperately hoped would end differently. It is impossible to reflect on this case without returning once more to Antonella Leardi. Her response transformed the meaning of her son's story in ways that no legal judgment could ever accomplish. History often remembers victims because of how they died. Occasionally, however, it also remembers the extraordinary dignity demonstrated by those left behind. Antonella consistently refused to allow grief to become an instrument of hatred. She understood that revenge cannot restore what violence has already taken. Another injured supporter, another grieving mother, or another funeral would never honor Ciro's memory. Instead, such acts would simply continue the same cycle responsible for his death. Her insistence on peace represented a profound moral choice, particularly because it emerged during a period of overwhelming personal loss. Many people admired her words precisely because they challenged deeply rooted assumptions about conflict. She demonstrated that forgiveness does not require forgetting, and that rejecting revenge does not diminish the pursuit of justice. The criminal justice system fulfilled its role by investigating the crime, identifying responsibility, and imposing punishment according to the law. Antonella fulfilled a different role by reminding society that legal accountability alone cannot heal communities divided by hatred. Healing also requires empathy, restraint, and the willingness to recognize the humanity of others even after suffering unimaginable loss. In many respects, her message became one of the most enduring legacies of the entire case. The story also serves as an important reminder of the responsibility carried by everyone connected with major sporting events. Football possesses an extraordinary ability to unite people across generations, cultures, and social backgrounds. Families spend weekends together supporting the same club. Friends build lifelong relationships through shared loyalty to their teams. Entire cities celebrate victories that become part of local identity for decades. Yet precisely because football inspires such powerful emotions, it also requires equally powerful commitments to responsibility. Passion is one of sport's greatest strengths, but passion without respect can become something entirely different. The tragedy surrounding Ciro Esposito illustrates how quickly enthusiasm can be overshadowed when individuals abandon the principles that make competition meaningful. Rivalry should inspire songs, banners, debates, and unforgettable atmospheres inside stadiums. It should never create circumstances in which supporters fear for their lives while traveling to watch a match. Another enduring lesson concerns the importance of evidence within the justice system. Throughout the investigation and trial, numerous claims, interpretations, and competing narratives emerged regarding the events preceding the shooting. Ultimately, however, the courts based their conclusions not upon rumor or public opinion, but upon witness testimony, forensic examination, ballistic analysis, medical evidence, and other material gathered during the investigation. High-profile cases often generate intense speculation, particularly when they involve emotionally charged subjects such as football rivalry. The Esposito case demonstrated why careful investigation remains essential. Justice requires patience, methodical analysis, and the willingness to examine every available fact before reaching conclusions. That process may appear slow compared with the speed of public debate, but it remains one of the fundamental safeguards of any legal system committed to fairness. More than anything else, Ciro Esposito's story reminds us that violence has consequences extending far beyond the immediate victims. One decision made during a chaotic confrontation altered the lives of countless people. His family lost a son. Friends lost someone they expected to grow old beside. The other injured supporters carried their own physical and emotional burdens. Police officers, medical professionals, investigators, and judges devoted years to responding to a tragedy that should never have occurred. Italian football itself was forced to confront difficult questions regarding supporter safety and the influence of violent extremist groups. The effects spread outward in widening circles, touching individuals who had never met Ciro personally but nevertheless found themselves changed by his story. This pattern is common in acts of violence. Their impact rarely ends where the physical act itself concludes. Instead, the consequences continue through families, institutions, communities, and future generations. Perhaps that is why Ciro Esposito's name continues to be remembered long after the details of the 2014 Coppa Italia final have faded from popular conversation. Sporting results inevitably become part of history, eventually replaced by newer championships and different heroes. Human stories endure because they speak to universal experiences: love, loss, courage, grief, hope, and the search for justice. Ciro's story contains each of those elements. It begins with an ordinary man traveling to support the football club he loved. It passes through unimaginable violence, a determined struggle for survival, an exhaustive criminal investigation, and a judicial process that established legal responsibility. Yet it ultimately arrives somewhere unexpected. A mother's refusal to answer hatred with hatred and a nation's renewed determination to confront violence surrounding the sport it cherishes. If there is a lasting message to be drawn from this case, it is perhaps this: football was always meant to bring people together, not separate them forever. Stadiums were built to celebrate competition, not to create new victims. Rival colors should symbolize identity without becoming reasons for hostility. Every supporter entering a stadium or traveling to an away match carries the same basic hope: to enjoy the game and return home safely. That hope should never depend upon which club they support, where they come from, or which scarf they wear around their neck. Ciro Esposito never reached the match he had traveled to watch. But his story continues to influence the way Italy remembers the responsibilities that accompany its passion for football. His life, his struggle, and the remarkable dignity shown by those who loved him remain enduring reminders that the true spirit of sport is measured not by trophies or victories, but by the value placed on every human life. Long after the chants fade, the stadium empties, and the final score is forgotten. That lesson continues to matter. Some stories end when a verdict is delivered. Others continue because the questions they raise are too important to disappear. The case of Ciro Esposito belongs to the second category. The conviction of Daniele De Santis provided a legal conclusion to the investigation and trial. But the deeper meaning of the tragedy continued to develop long afterward. The case became part of a larger national conversation about football, violence, public responsibility, and the limits of loyalty when passion becomes separated from humanity. More than a decade after the events of May 2014, the name Ciro Esposito remains connected not only to a crime, but also to a broader reflection on what sport should represent and what happens when the values of competition are replaced by hostility. The story began with something simple. A supporter wanted to watch his team play. Ciro Esposito was not traveling to Rome as a public figure or as someone seeking attention. He was one of thousands of Napoli fans making the journey to support SSC Napoli in a major final. He represented the ordinary supporter, the person whose connection to football comes from emotion, tradition, and a sense of belonging. His relationship with the club was not unusual. Millions of people around the world share the same experience every week. They wear their team's colors, follow matches with friends and family, and create memories around the sport they love. That ordinary beginning is precisely what makes the tragedy so powerful. Ciro's story demonstrates that behind every act of violence connected to sport is not simply a confrontation between groups, but a human life interrupted. Before his name became associated with one of Italy's most significant football tragedies, he was a son, a friend, a colleague, and a young man with an entire future ahead of him. The investigation and trial established the legal facts surrounding his death. Evidence collected from the crime scene, witness accounts, ballistic examinations, medical findings, and statements made during the investigation were examined through the judicial process. The court ultimately determined that Daniele De Santis was responsible for the shooting that caused Ciro's fatal injuries and for the harm suffered by the other supporters wounded during the incident. The sentence of 26 years imprisonment, later confirmed through the appeals process, represented the formal recognition of criminal responsibility. In a society governed by law, that process is essential. Justice cannot be based on anger, rumors, or public pressure. It must be built upon evidence and careful examination. The Esposito case demonstrated the importance of allowing the legal system to determine responsibility even when emotions surrounding a tragedy are overwhelming. Yet the conclusion of the trial did not mean the end of the story. A court can determine guilt, but it cannot measure the full human cost of a lost life. It cannot calculate the empty space left at family gatherings, the memories that friends continue to carry, or the moments that will never happen because someone did not return home. Those consequences exist beyond the reach of any sentence. They remain within the lives of those who knew Ciro personally and within the collective memory of those who followed the case. This is why the legacy of Ciro Esposito cannot be understood only through the legal documents of the trial. His importance comes from what his death represented and from the lessons that emerged afterward. Perhaps the most powerful part of that legacy remains the response of his mother, Antonella Lirdi. In the aftermath of her son's death, she had every reason to feel anger and demand revenge. Instead, she repeatedly called for calm and rejected further violence. Her message was simple but difficult. Ciro's death should not become a reason for another tragedy. She refused to allow her son's memory to be used as justification for hatred. This decision gave the case a meaning that extended beyond the criminal proceedings. It transformed Ciro's memory from one associated only with victimhood into one connected with dignity and responsibility. Her actions demonstrated that the response to violence does not have to be determined by violence itself. A person can seek justice while still rejecting revenge. A family can demand accountability while refusing to create another cycle of suffering. In this way, Antonella Leardi became an important symbol in discussions about football violence in Italy. Her words reminded supporters that passion for a club should never require hostility toward another human being. Football rivalries are built upon emotion, history, and competition. Those elements are part of what makes the sport powerful. But rivalry loses its meaning when it crosses the line into hatred. A football club can represent a city, a community, or a personal identity, but it should never become a reason to view another person as less valuable. The tragedy near Viale di Tor di Quinto revealed what happens when that boundary disappears. A disagreement between supporters became a situation involving real weapons, severe injuries, and irreversible consequences. The match itself became secondary. The football disappeared behind the tragedy. This remains one of the most important lessons of the case. Violence does not protect the honor of a club. It destroys the very values that supporters claim to defend. The impact of Ciro Esposito's death also extended into discussions about security at major sporting events. The incident demonstrated that protecting supporters requires attention beyond the stadium itself. Football matches involve entire cities, the roads supporters travel, the places where groups gather, and the routes they use before and after the event. The events of May 3, 2014 showed that security planning must consider the full environment surrounding a major match. After the tragedy, authorities placed greater emphasis on managing supporter movements, strengthening controls around high-risk events, and improving measures intended to prevent confrontations between rival groups. These changes reflected a broader recognition that public safety is a shared responsibility involving authorities, clubs, and supporters themselves. No policy can eliminate every possibility of conflict, but prevention begins with acknowledging risks and learning from past failures. The case also encouraged a deeper examination of the ultras culture in Italy. The word ultras has a complex meaning within football. Many organized supporters contribute passion, creativity, and atmosphere to the sport. They create songs, banners, and displays that form part of football's identity. However, certain groups associated with violent behavior have also created serious problems for clubs, authorities, and communities. Ciro Esposito's death intensified debate about how Italian football should respond to those who use supporter identity as a justification for aggression. The challenge has always been finding a balance between preserving the passion that makes football unique and preventing individuals from using that passion as a cover for violence. The majority of supporters who attend matches peacefully should not be defined by the actions of a violent minority. At the same time, the sport cannot ignore behavior that threatens the safety of everyone involved. This balance remains one of the ongoing challenges facing football, not only in Italy, but around the world. The memory of Ciro Esposito continues because his story represents a warning about the fragility of ordinary life. Tragedies often occur in moments that appear insignificant beforehand. A journey to a football match, a gathering of supporters, a confrontation lasting only minutes. These events can transform lives permanently. That reality encourages a broader reflection on personal responsibility. Every individual involved in a crowd, especially during moments of tension, has the ability either to escalate conflict or to help prevent it. Societies are shaped not only by the actions of those who commit violence, but also by the choices of those who witness it, respond to it, and decide what lessons to carry forward. The story of Ciro Esposito therefore remains relevant because it is not only about what happened in the past. It is also about the decisions people continue to make in the present. What does it mean to support a team? What responsibilities come with belonging to a group? How should communities respond when passion becomes dangerous? These questions remain important because the circumstances that produced this tragedy are not unique. Wherever large groups gather around strong identities, there is always a responsibility to ensure that belonging does not become a source of division and that competition does not become a reason for cruelty. Ultimately, the legacy of Ciro Esposito is defined by contradiction. His name is remembered because of a violent act. Yet the strongest message connected to him is one of peace. His death exposed the darkest side of football culture. Yet his family's response demonstrated some of the greatest examples of dignity and restraint. His story began with rivalry, but ended with a call for humanity. That contrast is what allows his memory to endure. Ciro did not choose to become a symbol, but his life and death became a reminder of values that extend far beyond one match, one club, or one city. The most meaningful way to remember him is not through anger, but through a commitment to ensuring that similar tragedies do not happen again. Every supporter who enters a stadium should be able to experience the joy of football without fear. Every family should be able to welcome their loved one home after a match. Every rivalry should remain a celebration of sport rather than a justification for violence. The story of Ciro Esposito remains one of the most painful chapters in modern Italian football history, but it also carries a message that continues to matter. Justice established responsibility. His mother demonstrated compassion. Society learned difficult lessons, and his memory continues to remind everyone that behind every team color, every chant, and every rivalry, there is something more important: human life.